Specifying constructor parameters when instantiating a class with a factory sometimes is necessary. Usually, constructor dependencies are automatically determined by the ObjectManager by using the constructor argument type signature, PHP doc type annotations, or the ObjectManager configuration. But under some circumstances, we don't want to use the automatic dependency resolution for all the constructor arguments, and instead want to specify one or more ourselves. In those cases, we can pass an array to the factory create method to specify the arguments. The array has to be a map, also known as a dictionary, meaning the keys of the array have to be strings. It must not be a numerically indexed array. The keys of the map are the constructor argument variable names that we want to specify, and the map values are the desired parameters. Let's add a couple of example constructor arguments to this something class to see how it works. Let's add a product repository, for example. And we'll call the variable name product repository. And now let's also add an untyped variable. And let's give it a string default value. And how about an array argument? Okay, I'll just initialize those as values and make them public. It just makes it easier for us to inspect them. Okay, now the ObjectManager can figure out the product repository argument itself because it's typed. But for primitive types like arrays or strings or untyped arguments, we have to specify the value when the object is created. Alternatively, a default value, like here in this example, has to be included in the constructor signature. Or the value has to be configured somewhere in the ObjectManager configuration, which we will get to in a couple of videos. So let's go ahead and create a factory for this version of something in the REPL and play a bit with different constructor parameters. So first I want to create an object factory. I'll copy a reference to the class. Append the factory suffix. And let's call create without any arguments. Okay, so that worked, and we can see it uses the default product repository and the default values for the other arguments. Now let's go ahead and specify a different value for some key. So we pass an array into the create method, and the array key will be some key, so it matches this variable name here. This is the important part, not the property name, but the argument parameter name. Some key, and the value will be bar. Okay, so now it took our different value as the second argument to the constructor. Let's also specify some SKUs. Like this. And yep, that also worked. So now let's see, if we want to specify a different product repository, we need an instance. And in order to be able to easily determine our instance is used, let's just create a class extending the regular product repository. So just by looking at the class name, we will be able to see ours is used. Now I need the product repository. So I'll just go ahead and copy the class name here. Okay, now let's instantiate that. assign it to a variable. And now we can instantiate our something class again and also pass in a product repository. And that worked. So this is possible because my repo also satisfies the type signature here, right? Because our class extending the product repository also is a product repository. So in this case, we specified all the constructor arguments. So this is almost like calling new, right? So we could say new with my repo bar and an array with some values. Right, same thing. The big difference is though, the new call takes positional constructor arguments and create takes named arguments. So the order doesn't matter. Now, for completeness sake, let's try some invalid variants. So what happens if we have a typo in a variable key? So instead of saying some key in camel case, let's type it in all lowercase. So it no longer matches the constructor's signature here, right? Some key, all lowercase. It's just ignored. So this would be just like typing a completely unknown key like this. Has no effect. Another variation that I want to try because I've seen other people try it is what happens if we pass the arguments to the create method just as if it were called to new, so as positional arguments. My repo, some key, and an array. So that gives us an exception. The type error argument 1 must be of type array, object given. So we can only pass an array to the create method. So what happens if we wrap this here in an array? So it's an array with positional arguments instead of named arguments. Well, in this case again, all the positional arguments are ignored and the default values are used. All this means that even though constructor arguments are local scope variables, the variable names exist as part of the public class API in global scope, just like the class name and the public methods. A consequence of this is that renaming a constructor argument variable is a backward compatibility breaking change. In Magento 2, the variable names in a constructor are part of a class's public interface. And because of this, constructor signatures in Magento tend to be very stable.